Bumin gave them a name, Istemi gave them a world, and then, within a single generation after both men were gone, their descendants began tearing that world apart. The united First Turkic Khaganate was not destroyed by one foreign invasion, it broke apart from within, and only then did its eastern and western halves fall to outside powers, slowly, then, all at once. And the story of how it happened is, in many ways, more interesting than the story of how it rose. To understand the collapse, you have to understand one structural problem the Khaganate carried from the very beginning. From the start, power was shared across two wings, the eastern heartland under the senior Qaghan and the western frontier under Istemi. Two wings, one empire. It worked because the two men trusted each other and never competed. But trust is not a system. It lasts only as long as the men who carry it. When Istemi died around 575, and when the eastern Qaghan Taspar died in 581, there was no longer anyone strong enough to hold the two wings together. Taspar had no clear successor, or rather, he had too many. His nephews, his brother's sons, commanders who had spent decades on campaign and believed they had earned the right to rule. All of them with claims, all of them with armies, and none of them willing to step aside. The man who first seized power in the east was Ishbara Khan. He was strong enough to take the throne, but not strong enough to keep everyone quiet. Almost immediately, a rival claimant, his own cousin Appa Qaghan, rose against him in the west. The empire that Bumin had built as one state now had two Qaghans simultaneously, each declaring the other illegitimate, each fighting for the loyalty of the same tribes, the same commanders, the same trade roads, clan against clan, brother against cousin, each one certain he was the rightful heir, each one willing to burn part of the empire to prove it. This was the wound, and it never closed. And into that wound stepped China. The Sui dynasty, newly unified after centuries of division, looked north at the fractured Turkic steppe and saw not a threat, but an opportunity. They did not send an army, not yet. They sent something more effective: gold, letters, carefully worded messages delivered to the right people at exactly the right moment. The Chinese court had studied the Turks carefully. They understood the clan structure, the rivalries, the pride. They knew which commanders felt overlooked, which princes believed they deserved more than they had been given, and they used that knowledge methodically. Emperor Wen of Sui wrote letters directly to Ishbara Khan that were designed to humiliate him in front of his own men, framing him as a vassal of China rather than an equal. At the same time, Chinese envoys quietly supplied Appa Qaghan with resources to continue his rebellion. Feed the fire on both sides. Let the Turks exhaust each other. It worked. Not because the Turks were naive, they had spent generations navigating the courts of Persia and Byzantium, but because the grievances between the clans were real, old, deep, and Chinese gold simply made those grievances easier to act on. By 584, Ishbara Khan was forced to acknowledge Sui supremacy, a humiliation that would have been unimaginable to Bumin or Istemi. The Qaghan, who had once commanded the greatest steppe empire on earth, was now sending tribute south. By 603, the fracture was complete. What had once been one empire was formally two. The Eastern Khaganate held the old Heartland, Mongolia, the Altai, the sacred ground where the wolf banner had first been raised. The Western Khaganate held Central Asia, the Silk Road cities, the steppe running toward Persia and the Caucasus. Same people, same language, same memory of the founders. But now that memory no longer united them. It belonged to two separate, competing states.
I wanted to sit with that for a second, because this is one of the oldest patterns in imperial history. It was not the enemy outside the walls that broke them. It was the fight inside the house. The Turks had freezed down empires, negotiated with shahs, sent envoys to Rome. And what finally broke them was something far more ordinary: cousins who couldn't agree on who came first.
The Eastern Khaganate survived for a few more decades after the split, but it was never again what it had been. The succession wars had drained the treasury, thinned the armies, and, most dangerously, broken the loyalty of the tribes. In the old days, tribal leaders had followed the Khagan because he was strong. Now, they watched, they calculated, they waited to see which way the wind blew before committing their men. Then the climate turned against them. In the late 620s, brutal cold, snow, and frost struck the steppe, killing herds and driving famine through the eastern tribes. Hunger is a faster way to break an army than any enemy sword. And then came the Tang. A new Chinese dynasty had risen. The Tang, one of the most sophisticated states of the medieval world. Where the Sui had been blunt and aggressive, the Tang were patient and precise. Emperor Taizong understood that he did not need to fight a full-strength empire. He only needed to wait until it was divided, weakened, and ready to break. In 630, that moment came. The Eastern Khagan Ilig had just suffered a catastrophic defeat against the Shuyan Tuo, a subordinate tribe that had risen in revolt. His authority was broken. His allies were watching from a distance. His treasury was empty. Taizong sent his armies north. The campaign was fast and decisive. Ilig was captured and brought to Chang'an, the Tang capital, where he was treated with careful, deliberate courtesy, given a title, given a residence, given everything except freedom and power. He died there, far from the steppe, far from the wolf banner, a living symbol of what had been lost. The eastern wing of the Turkic world, the Heartland, the sacred ground, the place where it had all begun, was gone, absorbed into the Tang Empire. The First Turkic Khaganate had given it a name. The Tang had erased it from the map. The West held longer. The Western Khaganate still controlled the Silk Road cities, Bukhara, Samarkand, Chach, the same cities Istemi had seized from the Hephthalites half a century before. It still had wealth. It still had armies. It still had the diplomatic connections to Persia and Byzantium that Istemi had spent his life building. But the same disease was there. The Western Khaganate was torn between two rival tribal confederations under Ashina rule, the Dulu and the Nushibi, each demanding supremacy, each willing to destabilize the whole structure rather than accept second place. Western Khagans rose and fell with alarming speed. Some ruled for months before being overthrown. The Silk Road cities, which required stability to function, began to look for other arrangements. Then the Tang pressed west. In 657, Tang forces defeated Ashina Helu, the last major ruler of the Western Turks. By 659, the old Western structure had been broken and placed under Tang control. The Arabs were not yet masters of Transoxiana, but after the fall of Sasanian Persia in 651, a new power was rising from the south. The world around the Silk Road was changing faster than the Western Turks could adapt, and they were no longer strong enough to hold it together. In just over 50 years after the split, an empire that had taken 2 generations of extraordinary men to build had been erased from the map. Almost erased, because history is rarely so clean as a map suggests. Empires do not simply vanish, they fragment, they scatter, and sometimes, in the right conditions, the fragments reassemble into something new. The steppe kept producing new powers, new alliances, and new rulers. The old Turkic world had not disappeared. It had broken apart, and its pieces were still alive. Out of the western steppe, from among the clans that had lived on the outer edge of the Khaganate's western wing, something was quietly forming. North of the Caucasus Mountains, along the western shores of the Caspian Sea, between the great rivers, the Don and the Volga. And somewhere in those lands, in the years after the last standard was lowered and the last great Khagan was taken into captivity, a new power was beginning to take shape. These were not men trying to rebuild the old Khaganate exactly as it had been. They were asking a harder question: what could be built from its ruins? Among these fragments, one answer emerged: the Khazars, a Turkic-led confederation with deep roots in the western steppe and the North Caucasus. They had watched the great Khaganate fall. They had survived the chaos that followed, and in that survival, they had learned something the old empire had forgotten: that the difference between a tribe and an empire is not armies or gold. It is discipline, unity, the willingness to build something that outlasts the man who starts it. Their story would become one of the strangest and most consequential in the medieval world. A steppe empire that stopped the Arab advance into Eastern Europe, held the balance of power between Byzantium and the Caliphate for 2 centuries, and made a choice about religion so unexpected that historians are still arguing about what it meant more than 1,000 years later. But that is the next chapter.
What makes this fall so powerful is that it wasn't caused by one enemy, one battle, or one mistake. The empire Bowman and Istemi helped it build was broken by succession, rivalry, foreign pressure, and a system that couldn't survive the man who created it. But the story doesn't end with collapse. From this fragment, a new Turkic power will rise next, the Khazars. Subscribe. This story is not finished yet.